Welcome back to True Echo, where powerful true-to-life stories echo across generations. Today's story is one you won't forget, a tale of quiet dignity, shocking disrespect, and the unexpected moment that silenced an entire airplane mid-flight. When an elderly black Navy veteran was asked to move seats for no reason, no one expected the pilot to walk out, salute him in front of everyone, and say words that would ripple far beyond 30,000 feet. This is a story of honor reclaimed, and the quiet power of being seen. Harold T. Merryweather never asked for much. At 76 years old, he'd grown used to the quiet margins of life. The places where people let you be, until they didn't. That morning, dressed in a brown cardigan and a clean-pressed pair of slacks, Harold moved through the terminal at Middle Georgia Regional Airport with practiced calm. In his hand, a boarding pass for Flight 228 to Colorado Springs. In his eyes, a flicker of emotion only visible to someone paying close attention. He wasn't headed on vacation. His great-grandson had just been born, and his granddaughter Rhonda had called him in tears, saying, "Papa, I want you to be the first to hold him after me." That was enough to book the ticket. Enough to pack a modest black suitcase and slip his Navy veteran cap, faded and fraying at the edges, onto his head. That cap didn't scream for attention. It never needed to. When he boarded, he found his seat, 12B, aisle. It was a good seat. Easy to get up from, close enough to the front to avoid the turbulence in the back. He stored his bag overhead and eased into the chair, pulling an old paperback from his coat. He'd read it so many times the cover was gone, the pages curled like leaves in late fall. Next to him, a teenage girl was already engrossed in her phone. Then came the tap. A young flight attendant with a high ponytail, clipboard tight in hand, leaned in. "Sir," she said, voice stiff but polite. "We need to move you to another seat. There's been a last-minute reassignment." Harold raised his brow. "My ticket says 12B. "Yes, but, there's been a mix-up. We appreciate your cooperation." Around them, conversations hushed. Someone glanced over. A man 2 rows back sat forward, watching. But Harold, always the one to keep peace, nodded. "No problem," he said, slowly rising. The ponytailed attendant smiled, too quickly. "You can leave your bag. We'll bring it to you." That gave Harold pause, but he nodded again. As he walked down the narrow aisle toward the rear of the plane, another attendant, a different one, helped a suited man with graying hair settle into 12B. Harold didn't say anything. He never did. They put him in 31E. Back row. Next to the lavatory. The air was heavier there, but Harold didn't complain. He didn't sigh. He simply sat, folding his coat across his lap like a man refusing to wrinkle the dignity he carried. Thomas Gaines couldn't shake what he'd seen. Sitting in 14A, he hadn't meant to watch the old man being moved. But something about it, it didn't sit right. The guy had a ticket. He'd been there first. Why shift him? He flagged a flight attendant, not the ponytailed one, but an older woman with tired eyes and decades of experience. "Hey," Thomas said quietly, "the gentleman from 12B, why was he moved?" She hesitated. "I'm not sure. I'll check." But she didn't come back. And Thomas's gut kept twisting. In row 31, Harold opened his book but didn't read. He couldn't. His eyes flicked to the window, then the aisle. He wasn't angry. He was tired. Tired in a way most people couldn't imagine, of decades of being overlooked, stepped around, asked to move, to wait, to lower his voice, his presence, his expectations. A toddler wailed a few seats away. Someone cursed under their breath. No one looked at Harold. Except Thomas. He clicked his call button. The ponytailed attendant returned. "I just want to understand," he said. "Why was that man moved from 12B?" "There was a last-minute reassignment," she said crisply. Thomas pointed discreetly. You gave his seat to that guy. The one in the blazer. Why? I'm afraid I can't disclose passenger details. That's a veteran, Thomas pressed. He didn't do anything wrong. But she just smiled and left. At 34,000 feet, silence is amplified. Thomas leaned back in his seat, chewing the inside of his cheek. His father used to say silence was cowardice wrapped in manners. In 31E, Harold sat with that same silence. He reached into his wallet, slid out an old photo, black and white, 5 young men in uniform, arms slung around each other, smiling like they hadn't seen death yet. 4 were gone now. Harold ran his fingers over their faces, then folded the photo back into his book. He hadn't come to be honored. He came to hold his great-grandson. But something in the air was shifting. In the cockpit, Captain Roy Delaney glanced at the flight manifest. Nothing unusual, until his eye caught a note scribbled beside a name. Row 12B, reassigned. Veteran. That didn't sit right. Delaney had flown commercial for almost 2 decades after a decorated Air Force career. Veterans didn't get reassigned without cause. And this one had been moved to the back. He made a mental note. And then, he acted. The intercom clicked. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I'll be stepping out momentarily to address something. The cabin shifted. Passengers paused movies. Conversations halted. The cockpit door opened. Captain Delaney stepped into the aisle, clean-shaven, crisp uniform, calm authority radiating off him. He didn't storm. He walked. Every row turned. Past 12. Past 20. Past 28. To 31. Harold looked up. Delaney stopped. Then, he saluted. Not for show. Not to reclaim order. But because it was the right thing to do. Mr. Merryweather, he said, voice clear across the cabin, served 3 tours in Vietnam. He pulled 6 men from a fire at Da Nang in 1970. That man has more courage in his bones than most people will know in a lifetime. You could hear the breath leave the cabin. Then, applause. It started slow, but then erupted. Hands clapping. Heads turning. Eyes wide. Harold blinked, stunned. Then slowly, he returned the salute. As the final claps died down, the silence that followed carried more weight than the applause. The respect, long overdue, hung in the recycled cabin air like incense in a chapel. Captain Delaney lowered his hand and stepped closer, still in the aisle. Sir, he said, voice lowered just enough that only the nearby rows could hear clearly, would you allow me to escort you back to your original seat? Harold blinked, his hand still resting gently on the edge of his tray table. Back to 12B. Delaney nodded once. That's where you were assigned. That's where you belong. There was a long pause. Harold didn't move, not yet. I don't want to cause any trouble, son. I've had enough of that in my life. You're not causing trouble, Delaney said softly. You're correcting a mistake. And I'm here to make sure it stays corrected. A beat passed. Then, Harold began to rise, slowly, with the kind of weariness that doesn't just come from age but from carrying years of grace under pressure. The woman beside him in 31E moved aside respectfully, her hands trembling slightly as she did. Across the cabin, Thomas sat forward, watching in disbelief as the old man and the captain started walking up the aisle side by side. Every eye followed. Some leaned out to watch. Others sat still but alert. They passed row 20. Row 18. Murmurs passed between rows. No one was on their phones now. For the first time all flight, every soul was tuned in, fully present. When they reached row 12, the suited man who had taken Harold's seat looked up, irritated. Delaney didn't break stride. Sir, he said clearly, this seat is no longer yours. The man scoffed. I paid extra for this seat. And you'll be refunded in full, Delaney replied, not missing a beat. But it doesn't belong to you. You were never assigned this seat. You can either move voluntarily, or ground security will greet you upon landing. The man looked around. Silence greeted him. No allies. No defense. No excuse. He grumbled, grabbed his briefcase and jacket, and stormed down the aisle without another word. Not one flight attendant moved to help. Captain Delaney turned and gestured. "It's yours again, Mr. Merryweather." Harold nodded once and eased into the seat. The moment he settled back, something shifted again in the cabin. A ripple, barely visible, but deeply felt. Then Delaney surprised everyone. He sat down too. Right in the middle seat beside Harold. The cabin collectively exhaled. "You don't have to do that, son," Harold murmured, quiet enough that only Delaney could hear. "I want to," Delaney said. For the rest of the flight. For the next hour and a half, the pilot remained in that seat. Not because he had to, but because it was right. Because sometimes, being in command doesn't mean flying the plane, it means standing beside the people others overlook. Near the back of the plane, the mood was different. Alyssa, the ponytailed flight attendant, stood rigid in the galley. She hadn't spoken since the salute. Her arms were crossed tightly, her breathing shallow. Beside her, Denise, the older attendant who'd been on the airline for nearly 3 decades, gave her a look that burned through steel. "You want to tell me now," Denise said calmly, "or wait until Captain Delaney asks himself?" Alyssa looked down. Her name tag had started to loosen, hanging awkwardly off her blouse. She fiddled with it, a nervous habit. "I didn't mean for it to be a thing," she whispered. "You moved a Vietnam vet to the back of the plane out of a paid seat," Denise said. "And now the captain's sitting next to him and half the passengers are whispering. It's a thing." Alyssa's jaw tensed. "The guy who wanted 12B, he's a platinum tier flyer. He complained. Didn't want to sit next to," she stopped herself. "Say it," Denise said, not angry, just steady. "He didn't want to sit next to that man," Alyssa finished quietly. "You mean Harold," Denise said. "You moved Harold for him." "I was trying to avoid a scene." Denise stared. "Well, congratulations. You made a bigger one than you can imagine." A cough sounded just outside the curtain. "Captain Delaney." He stepped in without waiting to be invited. "Denise," he nodded. Then he turned his eyes to Alyssa. "Got a second?" She froze. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. "I just want to know how a confirmed seat assignment for a veteran got changed at the last minute." Alyssa swallowed. "A frequent flyer wasn't happy. I tried to fix it quietly. I thought it would be easier." "You gave away his seat," Delaney said flatly. "To someone who asked, not earned. That wasn't easier. That was wrong." Alyssa looked down again. "It wasn't meant to be personal." Delaney's voice lowered. "Everything is personal when someone's dignity is involved." There was a beat of silence before Delaney added, "You'll be writing a full report when we land. And I'll be filing one, too." Alyssa nodded stiffly, saying nothing. Delaney turned and walked away without another word. Back in row 12, Harold sat quietly. He hadn't said much since returning to his seat. But he'd noticed the air shift. People walked differently. Looked differently. There was a reverence, not for war or medals, but for character. For a man who hadn't demanded respect but earned it anyway. The teenage girl beside him finally looked up from her phone. "Sir," she said softly, "were you really in Vietnam?" Harold turned to her, surprised by her voice. "Yes, ma'am. Long time ago now." "Did you really save 6 people from a fire?" He gave a faint smile. "I just did what anyone would do. We were in a bad spot. You don't think too hard in moments like that. You just move. She nodded, chewing her lip, then reached into her bag and pulled out a cookie wrapped in a napkin. For your great-grandkid, she said. Or just, for you. Harold accepted it like it was a badge. From across the aisle, Thomas caught the exchange and smiled, quiet and genuine. Further down the plane, the whispers continued. Why was he moved in the first place? Did someone complain? That was so wrong. In the galley, Alyssa heard every word. Her hands trembled slightly now, but she said nothing. She didn't know yet what would happen when she wrote her report, but she knew she'd have to account for every choice she made on that flight. Meanwhile, Captain Delaney pulled out a notepad from his jacket pocket, scribbled something, and folded the paper neatly. He handed it to Harold. Give this to your granddaughter. Just a letter of acknowledgement. Not much. But if anyone questions what happened today, it'll remind them someone saw it. Harold accepted the note. I appreciate it, son. No, sir, Delaney replied. I appreciate you. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as Flight 228 began its slow descent into Colorado Springs. The usual instructions came over the intercom: seat backs upright, tray tables stowed, electronic devices off or on airplane mode, but this time, they landed softer. More respectfully. Something about the flight had changed everyone, even if they couldn't quite explain how. In row 12, Harold Merryweather sat quietly. The cookie the girl gave him was still in the folded napkin, resting on his lap. He hadn't eaten it. He wasn't hungry. He was reflecting. It had started like any other flight. He'd boarded with a purpose, to meet his great-grandson for the first time. He had packed light and expected nothing except to be there for his family. But somewhere between boarding and cruising altitude, his seat had been taken, and his dignity quietly challenged. And yet, here he was. Not just back in his seat, but seen. Acknowledged. And not because he demanded it, but because someone chose to do what was right. Across the aisle, Thomas Gaines leaned forward. The entire flight, he'd wrestled with the guilt of staying silent too long. But now, as the runway loomed beneath them, he couldn't leave it unsaid. Sir, he said gently. Harold turned his head, eyebrows raised. I just wanted to say. I saw what they did to you. It wasn't right. And I should have spoken up sooner. But you handled it with a kind of grace I don't think I could have. Harold studied him, then nodded slowly. You spoke eventually. That's more than most. I'm headed home, Thomas said, but I'll remember this flight a long time. Then maybe it was worth it, Harold replied. The woman across the aisle, who hadn't spoken the entire trip, leaned over and added, that boy of yours, he's lucky. He's got something most of us don't. Harold looked at her. And what's that? A living example. He gave a tired, soft smile, the kind that came from deep places, forged through decades. As the wheels touched down, no one rushed to stand. Not like usual. They waited, out of instinct, out of decency. The ding of the seatbelt sign going off didn't send people scrambling for the overhead bins. For once, they let someone else go first. Harold stood slowly, steadying himself. From the cockpit, Captain Delaney emerged once more, holding a folded envelope. Mr. Merryweather, he said as Harold stepped into the front of the cabin, one last thing. He handed him the envelope. It's a contact at our Veterans Partnership Division. They'd like to speak with you. About sharing your story, on your terms. Harold took it, but didn't respond right away. Delaney continued, stories like yours, they matter. I'm just one man. Exactly, Harold said. One man can change everything. Passengers watched from their seats, still quiet. Thomas gave a small wave. The teenage girl mouthed, thank you. Delaney offered a firm handshake. No, sir. Thank you. Harold stepped through the jet bridge alone. But he didn't walk small. Outside Gate B7, the terminal buzzed with its usual chaos. Screens blinked. Suitcases rolled. Voices echoed in 100 directions. But Harold only saw one thing, Rhonda. Mid-30s, hair pulled back, a navy hoodie hugging her shoulders. She bounced a baby carrier in one arm and waved with the other. "Papa," she called, voice already cracking. Harold smiled, real and unguarded for the first time that day. He moved toward her as fast as his knees would allow. She met him halfway, wrapped her arms around him tightly. "You made it," she whispered. "You doubted me," he teased, the gravel in his voice warm now. She pulled back just enough to hold up the carrier. "Meet Miles." Harold leaned down, eyes scanning the tiny face beneath the soft blanket. And in that second, something shifted inside him. It wasn't pride. It wasn't even joy. It was possibility. Possibility that the world he'd fought through might not have to be the one this boy grew up in. He gently laid the stuffed elephant he'd picked up in the airport next to the baby's hand. "You don't know it yet, little man," he whispered, "but this world's got work to do. And you're gonna help it along." Rhonda wiped her cheek. "You okay, Papa?" He straightened up, nodded. "Yeah. Just thinking about what I want to tell him when he's older." "You'll have time," she said. "You're going to be part of everything. First steps. First words. All of it." They sat together at the baggage carousel. She handed him a sandwich, his favorite, turkey with a little mustard. He took a bite. No more words were needed for a while. Finally, she asked, "Was the flight okay?" Harold chuckled softly. "Let's just say," he replied, "it had a few surprises. But it turned out all right. Some people did the right thing. That's what matters." She studied him a moment, her eyes narrowing playfully. "You've always had that effect on people. You make them want to do better. You saying I guilt the whole plane into a conscience?" She laughed. "I'm saying they looked at you and remembered what decency looks like." 3 days after Flight 228 landed, the airline issued a bland statement. No names. No apology. Just, "We are reviewing an incident on Flight 228 involving a seating issue and are committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with dignity and fairness." But Harold didn't need a headline. He wasn't waiting for a press conference or a plaque. Because the moment that teenage girl handed him a cookie. The second that Captain saluted him in silence. The minute that man in row 14 stood up and said, "That wasn't right." That was all the thanks he ever needed. As Harold later sat on his porch, the folded letter from Captain Delaney resting in his jacket pocket and the photo of baby Miles beside him, he understood something. Dignity doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen, and once it is, it changes everything. So if you ever find yourself in a moment where it's easier to stay quiet than speak up, remember Flight 228. Remember the aisle. Remember the salute. Be the person who does what's right, even when no one else will. If this story made you pause, feel, or reflect, subscribe to True Echo. Comment your thoughts, share this story with someone who needs it, and most of all, stay loud when it matters.